All right, we're live. Hey, everybody. Welcome. It's Max Blumenthal, and we're here exclusively at Rockfin, which means I have to hit go live at two separate platforms. And I think we're discussing one of the more momentous issues right now for the future of human survival. It's something that's being framed in US media by the New York Times as an anxious Japan responding to an aggressive China. But what we're seeing is the Biden administration encouraging Japan to engage in its most aggressive posture of militarization since World War II. And the Japanese administration of Kishida and the Liberal Democratic Party fully embracing this remilitarization plan and pledging to double Japan's military budget. So what does this mean for China? What does this mean for a potential future conflict between the US and China? Something that US military brass have been projecting, referring to the Ukraine proxy war as a kind of preparation for the ultimate war with China. Well, to discuss this further, I've invited my friend Joseph Essertier, who is a scholar activist based in Japan and the Japanese coordinator for World Beyond War, to explain the internal dynamics in Japan and the regional geopolitical dynamics and project forward what this extremely disturbing development means for the future of peace in the region. So welcome, Joseph. How are you doing?
Hi, thank you.
Joseph, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started with the conversation.
Okay. I work at a university in Japan, and I've been an activist for about 2 decades, almost all working on peace, advocating peace on the streets, often on the streets, and writing. And I've been in Japan for almost 3 decades. So in a way, I'm a little bit Japanese.
Yeah.
I grew up in California, in Southern California, and I think that's good enough.
Well, I mean, having been there for 3 decades, speaking the language, being integrated into the society, and being a peace activist in a society that's really in a political culture that's trending rightward and that has been pretty solidly right wing even since World War II, must give you a unique perspective. Tell me what's been happening since Shinzo Abe's assassination and what Abe's real legacy is in terms of this remilitarization plan.
Okay. The remilitarization has been happening really ever since Japan's constitution was passed back at the end of the 1940s. But it really accelerated under Shinzo Abe. And the present Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, is basically following in Abe's footsteps. The LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which has been the ruling party all through the post-war period, except for a short period when other Liberal Party took over. That LDP has long been trying to put Japan back where it was, and they still have dreams of an empire and being the dominant force in East Asia, if not the world. The LDP is very much tied in with the United States. There's evidence that they get funding from the CIA. that's been coming out just recently.
Right.
So
Abe was essentially kind of a CIA asset.
right. And so Kishida is just following in Abe's footsteps, and but unfortunately, the world has become a more violent place, and they have good excuses for building up Japan's military. And unlike in previous periods, during the last year, more and more, it seems like the majority of the population of Japan, a slight majority, are in favor of building up their military, getting ready to fight. And that, this is scary for people in East Asia, given the history of the colonialism of the Empire of Japan. Japan has been militarizing islands in the Ryukyu island chain, which goes
Yeah.
from Kyushu. Kyushu is in the west or southwest. It's the closest part to Taiwan that is mainland Japan.
Yeah.
And going from there all the way down to Taiwan, this whole island chain, there's just been at least 10 islands that are being intensely militarized in the last 5 years. Bases and weapons and vehicles and
Yeah.
lots of, yeah, you get the idea.
And talk a little bit about Japan's military industry, and how it's sort of ramping up production and new technology.
Yes. Let's see. I made a list of. There's just so much has been happening in the last few months.
I mean, it's my understanding Mitsubishi's developing long-range missiles, which could strike into core Chinese cities.
Right. Mitsubishi. Basically, here's a good summary that I found on the internet. Japan has created its first amphibious military unit since World War II and launched a new class of high-tech frigates. The one that's being launched, that was launched by Mitsubishi in 2021, is called Noshiro.
Yeah.
And it's restructuring its tank force to be lighter and more mobile and building up its missile capabilities. And Mitsubishi is extending the range of Japan's Type 12 surface-to-ship missile. And that will give Japan the ability to attack enemy bases. And I think that's probably the number one issue amongst people that I'm talking to.
Yeah.
The fact that Japan is preparing, it's like we're supposed to be, because of the peace constitution, Japan's supposed to be on the defensive, but now we're getting ready to actually destroy enemy bases in foreign countries. That does not, you can't even, before you could kind of make an excuse. Oh, the self-defense forces, that's to protect Japan. That's defensive. And F-16s, maybe we need those because maybe if
Right.
we get attacked. But now it's just out of control. And there's I've got a list here. There's just all kinds of weapons that are being produced, and Japan is selling weapons over in other countries.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting the way this is being portrayed in the U.S. media, because it's being portrayed entirely as a defensive alliance. I mean, I'll show you a New York Times article. This is a big New York Times spread. This is actually a cover story on the front page of the New York Times, but the headline was actually different. It was that an anxious Japan seeks help from the U.S. in defending itself against China. But here you just see, as China's power grows, I mean, obviously there were, Chinese missile tests that upset Japan, but here you see the New York Times framing it entirely in terms of Japan responding to a Chinese threat. Whereas the Chinese response, which we've seen from the Global Times is that this is bringing back historical demons from World War II.
Right. Right. It's
None
scary.
of that's mentioned here.
Yeah, I
So
found my list.
yeah, please.
We have the Type 16 Maneuver Combat Vehicle, or MCV, which is an armored fighting vehicle, like a kind of like a tank on wheels.
Yeah.
Those are being driven on, or one was driven on a public road recently, down on an island in Ryukyu. We have General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper deployed to Kagoshima. That's clearly for preparing for battles with China. That would provide intelligence and reconnaissance support. Assault amphibious vehicles, Ospreys, Japan's buying them. The U.S. military in Japan has them. Those are for moving Marines and moving troops and equipment very quickly from island to island. Patriot missiles, HIMARS, radar being built in Yonaguni. 18 F-35s are supposed to be purchased this year, and 2 aircraft carriers. Most countries don't have an aircraft carrier, but Japan had one called the Izumo, which is only supposed to be for helicopters, but now they're going to have another one called the Kaga, and that's being refit to accommodate the F-35. Also, Tomahawk missiles, submarines, and warships. So it's just it's hard to keep up with how quickly the militarization. It's like Kishida just stepped on the gas pedal, just going straight for World War III. So it's China. If I was Chinese, I'd be worried.
Yeah. When you say going straight towards World War III, here are comments by a U.S. Marine general who is stationed in the East. Marine General James Bierman has said that the U.S. began preparing Ukraine for an inevitable proxy war back in 2014 with Russia, and that the Ukraine proxy war is actually setting the theater in Japan, in the Philippines, for another war with China over the Taiwan Strait. So here you have him. He told this to the Financial Times, a top Marine general essentially saying that, yes, everything happening in Ukraine is setting the stage for World War III, and that Japan will be the base for launching that war, along with the Philippines and obviously Taiwan. I believe that Kishida has said that any attack on Taiwan would be responded to by Japan. And
that's right.
What sort of strikes me is what strikes me is that, okay, in the US, we're thousands of miles away. A proxy war is taking place in Ukraine. So American soldiers are not coming back like in the Iraq war, their legs blown off or in coffins draped in American flags. So there's very little pressure on Biden, except vis-a-vis the billions and billions of aid that's being sent to shady Ukrainian warlords and oligarchs and who knows where. But with Japan, I mean, for Japanese people, this is a matter of life and death. They could be incinerated in seconds. And, I have been South Korea, so I was able to talk to people there, and it is a very right-wing militarized society. But there's still an understanding there that there should be some kind of détente, and this is an absolute last resort, except among the real hardliners I spoke to. But it doesn't. Is there any resistance to this program within Japanese civil society? I mean, you are a coordinator of Japan's branch of World Beyond War. Is there any concrete resistance to this mad dash to a war that would see millions die in the region? Why are Japanese people supporting governments like Kishida, who are carrying out Abe's fanatical militaristic wishes?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people, probably the majority of the people, think that they're being protected by Kishida and the U.S. military, and so and they're just not paying attention. A lot of people are just asleep right now, I think.
Yeah,
they don't actually feel the tension. I think as much as probably people in South Korea they've been right next to that tension between North Korea and South Korea. Seoul is not that far from North Korea, so maybe it's a little different there. Here, I think, but yeah, there are protests. Ryukyu is the best example, and they have constant protests and very large protests. And there things are coming out all the time from there. Joint statements from intellectuals and anti-war activists. That's how.
Yeah.
Let's see. I have my information I have is too detailed, but yeah, there's tons of stuff happening down in Ryukyu. Here though, I live on Honshu, which is the main island, and I live in Nagoya, which is between Tokyo and Kyoto. So I'm kind of right in the center. And here we have protests. We have weekly protests against the building. Now there's one major military base that's being built for the U.S. military, being paid for by Japanese taxpayers. And we're constantly protesting against that, trying to build support to block or stop or at least slow down the construction. And there are people here who talk about the crimes that Japan committed against the Chinese and Koreans.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of stuff. Yeah. But unfortunately we're a small group. We're a very small, tiny minority. The demonstrations here they're much bigger in the United States, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and the demonstrations against the Ukraine proxy war have been pretty small so far. There was one in New York that was, from what I could tell, pretty underwhelming. But there's a lot of anger online. It just hasn't played out in the streets. I would just think this would be more existential for Japan and Japanese people. I wonder what kind of pressures are working on younger people in Japan. I mean, you mentioned that people are sort of tuned out. I mean, is it that they're so absorbed in screens and online culture that they've been effectively depoliticized? In South Korea, one of the major issues was just simply the military culture, where
Right.
young men have to enlist. It was very similar to Israel. And then the military becomes the main institution for cultivating pro-war sentiment. And you can actually feel that in the society. I don't understand Japan quite as well, but I would assume it's sort of the siege mentality that's inculcated, through anti-China and anti-communist rhetoric, and obviously the blitzkrieg they must get of U.S. media.
Yeah, we are very much tied in with U.S. media. So sometimes when it's just the United States fighting somewhere, then we'll get a slightly more objective perspective, like the war in Afghanistan. I remember there was a interview. A Japanese man was interviewing an Afghani whose house had been destroyed and his whole family had been killed, and he was like, who is Osama bin Laden? I don't. And so there's that kind of sometimes that happens, but right now the media is just so tight. There's so little criticism. If I want to find out what Japanese like I would say dissenting voices within the establishment, what are they saying? It's often easier for me to watch Chinese or read Chinese state media than it is to watch or read articles in Japanese or English articles from Japanese media. So people just don't actually. I think young people. I talk to young people because I work in a university. they just have so little understanding of history, and they are not reading the newspaper.
Yeah.
That's it. Very, very different from previous generations. In some ways, they're better informed about what's current events. The ones who are curious, but on the whole, they've been so encouraged to avoid politics. Most of them are just asleep. They don't know what's going on. They're just focusing on their studies and getting a job and getting ahead in society. So yeah, there's a huge gap there's a generation gap, and almost all the people who are involved in anti-war activism in Japan are elderly. I'm one of the younger people, actually, and
Really?
there are very few, very few young people. So it's a depressing situation here.
Yeah, I see that across the West, actually. Maybe to a lesser extent in Europe, but our rallies here in the US typically have a disproportionate representation of older people. And a lot of times when I get up to speak at the rallies, I say never trust anyone under 40 or under 30. What are they doing? I mean, when you see activism of young people, it's like you'll see some glassy-eyed young people kind of gluing themselves to the floor at art museums or like throwing paint on some Van Gogh painting to protest the climate emergency. But they're not really protesting what seems like a nuclear war emergency, which is
Yeah,
staring us right in the face.
right. But to be fair, they listen. So
Yeah.
I don't have so many opportunities on campus to talk, but when I'm on the streets, we stand on the corner once a week on Saturday night, and for 1 hour, and the majority of the people walking by are young people, and they listen. They're interested, and we have people stopping all the time, and they're like, "Wow, what is this?" And they come and they try to read our banners, and they take photos. They send them to their friends, and so they're interested in, and uh, they're young, so
Yeah.
but they just like we're almost on another planet. They don't. I think they just don't know where to start, and so it's really that's our responsibility. We have to find a way to connect with them, and it's not necessarily on the streets. Maybe we need to connect through the internet.
Yeah, I mean, I do get a decent amount of correspondence from Japan, and I've had Grayzone articles republished in Japanese, but it's
Yeah.
something I've always wanted to do is try to reach that audience with a stable platform. I don't quite know how to do it, but I think it would make a major impact because it doesn't seem like there is much anti-war programming or critical history. It makes me wonder what takes place in public elementary curriculum in Japan. You would think in a country like Japan, there would be something similar to what took place in Germany, where there was a re-examination of the past, something that there was a process in Germany throughout the 1970s where Germany went through a kind of national
Right.
crisis with the Red Army faction and bombings, and there was talk of a new emergency law, kind of Patriot Act. But the German leadership, the West German leadership said, no, we're not going to fall for that. And even figures
Mhm.
associated with the German war machine, at least the German military brass that weren't ideologically Nazi, their family members actually publicly opposed it. And Ulrike Meinhof, who was killed in a German prison, who was the, Meinhof of the Baader Meinhof gang carrying out lots of terrorist bombings around Germany, was actually granted a state funeral in Strasbourg as a way of saying, no, we're not going to go back to the past. I know that Japan.
Yeah. No, Japan has not gone through anything like that. That's the big problem. And so there's this history that's just sitting there waiting to be read. It's in the
Yeah.
encyclopedias. You can read about the comfort women issue. You can read about forced labor of Koreans.
Yeah.
You can read about these mines where Chinese were just used like disposable tissue as workers, and then just thrown into these pits after they had served the purposes of, helping the Empire of Japan. There's this dark history of atrocities that were committed by the Empire of Japan, and it's just sitting there, but people aren't reading it because they're not forced to. And that was also partly the fault of the United States in the post-war period. The U.S. Censored information about World War II, and actually even Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so people just didn't know. They didn't know until after Japan regained its sovereignty in the early 1950s. Until that point, there was just
sort of an information blackout. I mean, they would not have been exposed to any.
Right.
You would think that having experienced Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there would be this deep resentment.
Yeah.
For
and there isn't.
Just everything that emanates from the imperial Japanese culture and ideology, and for the relationship with the United States, because it was the United States that did this to them,
right,
on the false basis that an amphibious invasion would have killed millions of, or left a million American service members wounded, and that there was no path to negotiation with this psychotic imperial government.
Right.
But that's not there.
No, it's not. There's no anger, because they just don't know what happened. They just don't.
Yeah.
And the information is all there. You can look it up on the internet. It's in Japanese. They're Japanese, and Japanese intellectuals are good. They're doing their job. They're writing the history.
Yeah.
There's information coming out all the time. There's massive amounts of translations from English books, great books that are published in English. They're very good about translating stuff right away. And so it's all, the information is there, but I guess that there was just this long period where you have the information blackout, and then just constant propaganda from the United States. Television, like a friend of mine said, the national flag of Japan should be Mickey Mouse, because it's, it's just like this Disney world. And the post-war economy was so good.
Right.
The 60s and 70s, Japan experienced the greatest improvement in standard of living of any country in history. So just, the majority of the population were farmers, and suddenly they're living almost the kind of standard of living that Americans are living, the richest country in the world. So that, I think that put a certain amount of conservatism into the society. When people got wealthy, their lives got so much better. And so why ask questions? Forget about history. Well, that's the past. That's the dark past, and that was just an anomaly. And now we're it's a democratic country. We're free and liberal, and Japan did have a lot of freedom. The Constitution was, gave Japanese human rights, and gave workers the right to strike. The land reform was incredible. They take the land from the rich and give it to the poor. Literally, they just transferred wealth. So all these farmers who had nothing before, suddenly they've got a little farm. They've got a decent life, and then they've got a color television, a nice car, the street. They've got nice paved roads, and excellent doctors, excellent medicine. Just life just became so good. And so, and you're being encouraged constantly to ignore the past. That's just, forget about that. So that's kind of my image of how this huge, this incredible, basically intellectual poverty when it comes to history came about.
Well, there's a portion of the Japanese population, and I guess you're pointing to especially the millennial and Generation Z sector or demographic, that is not interested in this history. But there's also a portion that has succumbed to a kind of nostalgia for Imperial Japan and this stabbed in the back mentality that we saw present in Weimar Germany, in post-World War I Germany. And you see it play out particularly around the Yasukuni Shrine each year. And I want you to talk about that. This is the scene outside the Yasukuni Shrine this year, this August, in the sweltering heat. You can see just lines and lines of Japanese people lining up to pay homage to those who are buried there.
Yeah.
Just endless lines.
There are many wars going on right now.
Yeah.
I came to pray and hope that fewer people will die in wars.
But he obviously doesn't know what's there.
Yeah, that's not what this is about. Okay, and there's the Imperial Japanese flag.
People from other countries may say certain things, but this issue belongs to the Japanese people. So only the Japanese people can decide for themselves. For that reason, we should visit the shrine without ambiguity. It's a day for worship, to look back upon the past, reflect on it, and pray.
Yeah. There are people who are enshrined, normal people too. It's not just war criminals.
Right. Well, here's a very peaceful looking display. Not disturbing at all.
Like right back in the 1930s.
Many Japanese lawmakers participate in honoring the war criminals buried at the Yasukuni Shrine. Top level officials, and you see some of them there. But just I guess give us some history of this shrine and what it means in contemporary Japan, and who are the people being honored there by average Japanese citizens and top officials alike.
Yeah, it's a religious institution. Shintoism, you might have heard of. The word Shinto didn't appear until the late 19th century, and it was an invention. But all of the shrines, there were shrines that were just like local religious practices. They were all put together into one under the emperor, and so they but Yasukuni Jinja has a long history. It goes back to before the war, and they enshrine soldiers to so people can pay respects and they can pray to them. There's ancestor worship in Japan, right?
Right.
People pray to their ancestors. So that's fine, and it's fine to remember how the people who fought for your country. It's easy to forget that Japan was threatened by the West. Japan could have been colonized like almost every other non-European country. But by 1901 or so, Japan was already had an empire and was starting to on the same path as the Western powers, colonizing and just getting greedier and greedier, the empire of Japan. But after World War II, all these war criminals were enshrined at Yasukuni. So it's a mix of ordinary soldiers and like top level war criminals who bore responsibility for the tragedy, the death and destruction of Japan's the China War and the Pacific War. It's understandable that people would want to go there and pay respects. They might even have family members, their own ancestors there. But it was really, it seems like whoever designed that, whoever set that up, which is definitely the government of Japan, set it up in a very devious way so that people, there's no way to separate them. You have,
right. So that when if you go to pay respect to family members, you're also simultaneously paying respect to war criminals, people who may have participated in the rape of Nanking. I mean, there are these stories of Japanese officers who participated in decapitation contests on their way to Nanking, how many they could decapitate, just hideous human rights crimes.
Yeah.
And they're there, Class A war criminals among average people.
Right. That's the problem. And so it really needs to be separated. Somebody needs to just say, okay, everybody who loves war criminals, okay, here's your place to worship war criminals. But ordinary people, this is your place. And so, but and every time a high-ranking official like Koizumi, Prime Minister Koizumi, he established a pattern of visiting Yasukuni Shrine, and every time a high-profile person does that, it just brings back the wounds, memories of World War II, and inflames tensions. The lady saying, like, well, either way, if you want to forget history, then don't inflame the tensions, and don't remind people in East Asia and Southeast Asia, former colonies of Japan, don't remind them of the horrible things that you did to them. But no, ideally we would remember history, and if you're going to remember history, then you have to deal with it. Like Germany did, and that's a very good comparison. Comparing Germany to Japan, Japan really has to go through the same process, and it has to make apologies. I mean, it's hard for me to speak as an American, because when did we apologize? Have we ever? Is there even any discussion of us apologizing to Vietnam as our government? Is there pressure? What kind of memorials do we have in the United States to remember the crimes that we committed against Vietnamese? So it's hard for me to speak, but yeah, Americans and Japanese need to atone for their crimes, and unfortunately, we inherit that. I would love to just say I would love to just live a normal, peaceful life in Japan, but as an American living in Japan, I carry the weight of that, and I also benefit from you benefit as a member of the empire. We don't call ourselves an empire, but as an American, just walking around in the world, you reap profits. You profit from that violence, whether you like it or not. And so the way I look at it, we've got blood on our hands, and the only way you can get it off your hands is to speak up and protest and study history. Try to make up for what our countries did in the past, like with slavery or the Japanese Americans, the internment camps in California.
Right. Well, I mean, you bring up a really interesting point that could be made on a broader international level, especially with respect to the West. And yet, I grew up. I'm Generation X, so growing up in the U.S., I did witness a period in which the baby boomer generation, at least part of it, went through a re-examination of the American soul through the Vietnam War era and the Civil Rights era. And, in the 1980s, you saw this string of films about Vietnam that painted the U.S. as not just, a country that had made a terrible mistake, but actually as a predatory empire. Mm-hmm. Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, these films by the greatest filmmakers, Kubrick and Oliver Stone, were part of that process. Of course, it led to nowhere because of the end of once the Cold War ended. It was not only the U.S. imperial structure that embraced this role as global hegemon, but also a large part of that liberal baby boomer generation became a part of it through the Clinton years and shed their own inhibitions about imperialism as they just embrace the Democratic Party. And you can see that today in what the Democratic Party has become. It is the pro-war party. There's a wing of the Republican Party that has inhibitions about what's taking place in Ukraine for their own reasons, but it's not allowed in the Democratic Party. You're not allowed to be against aid. And then you have the whole issue of history here in the US. Okay, the Republicans, the Republicans on the state level are blocking what they call critical race theory. And some of that stuff, it is goofy to me, a lot of it. And, trying to just a lot of the racial training that takes place. But there's also, an element where the Republicans are simply saying anything relating to examining the brutality of American slavery, what the Confederacy did, the extermination of American Indians, or as you mentioned, the concentration camps that the FDR administration placed Japanese Americans in, that's also critical race theory. So they're essentially illegalizing that. They're promoting in Florida under Governor Ron DeSantis anti-communist education as part of the curriculum in Florida public schools. So this is all happening here on a parallel track to what's taking place in Japan with this nostalgia for imperial Japan. And then you have, and this is particularly being embraced by the liberal intelligentsia in the US, support for literal Nazis in Ukraine. And complete ignorance about what they did. And if you actually look back, it's always been there. The US, there's always been an element of the US ruling elite that sought an alliance with Nazi Germany and reluctantly aligned with the Soviet Union to defeat Nazism and fascism across Europe. And here's a hilarious exchange that took place on Twitter, where Michael McFaul, the former US ambassador to Russia under Obama, we call him at the Grayzone McPhail or McFool, because he's really one of the dumbest people on Twitter, which therefore has granted him a position at Stanford. He said, I'm not an expert on World War II. Okay, you're not an expert on World War II. You should at least know like basic things if you are claiming to be an expert voice on Russia-Ukraine affairs, because that's what this is all about. Were people in 1943 still discussing what annexed lands Hitler would get to keep as part of a peace settlement? Okay, now, whoops. Thank you to Morales Alzafarks or whatever your account is. I mean, it's one of these. I don't even know what that is. But, this account pointed out, yes, Allen Dulles was sent by the State Department in 1943 to negotiate a U.S.-only withdrawal from the war, and he enthusiastically supported the preservation of Hitler's Greater Germany as part of an anti-Soviet plan for order and rehabilitation in Europe. And here you have Allen Dulles was speaking as Bull, like his code name was Bull, and he was going to meet a representative of Hitler. And this is what Dulles said. He said, in the future, a situation will never be permitted to arise where nations like Germany would be compelled to resort to desperate experiments and heroism as a result of injustice and want, referring to the Versailles Treaty. The German state must continue to exist as a factor of order and rehabilitation. The partition of Germany or the separation of Austria is out of the question. And then goes on to call for the establishment of a cordon sanitaire against Bolshevism and Pan-Slavism through a strong Hungary and Poland. Exactly what you're seeing right now, by the way, with NATO. And Allen Dulles, he loved the Nazis so much. This is in David Talbot's book, The Devil's Chessboard. He describes this well. Allen Dulles loved the Nazis so much that when he was going over to Germany to pal around with Nazi officials as the head of the OSS, they actually made him a dangle. The federal law enforcement in the U.S. actually made him a dangle, and the FDR, NSC was actually listening in on these conversations because they wanted to know what the Nazis' next move was. And so they were like, let's follow this guy because he's basically our Nazi in our government. So McFaul didn't even know that. Americans don't even know that. And now McFaul, I mean, we reported this at the Grayzone, actually had a meeting, a literal meeting, public meeting with members of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion when they went on a speaking tour to Stanford. So what we're seeing with, whether it's with Japan or Ukraine, is we're seeing the US and NATO kind of returning to its natural place,
Yeah.
which is, and also I would say with Syria as well, supporting jihadist elements, the natural place, which is encircling its enemies with Nazis, imperial Japanese fascists, and jihadists. Those are our natural, the natural allies of our ruling elite.
Yeah, racism and religious intolerance. And somehow, I don't know how Japanese and South Koreans see themselves fitting into NATO. And now they're talking about, these two countries are talking about joining NATO. And for the first time, Kishida went to a NATO conference. First time for a Japanese prime minister to attend one. I don't know what they're thinking, like that they're going to be accepted into this. And now we've got the West against Russia and China, against the West versus the East. Well, South Korea and Japan are part of the East, so it's only going to go. You're only going to go so far. You're only going to. I don't understand why Japanese are so. I mean, but it's propaganda, I guess. There's just been so much, 3/4 of a century of just heavy U.S. propaganda. I mean, in even Disney films.
Yeah, people don't realize this was part of the Marshall Plan, which is so celebrated in our culture, was to kind of hack the brains of German and Japanese people and make them believe that the U.S. is their only ticket to prosperity and peace. And
right, it's the carrot of they had to sort of set up a nice, gentle capitalism that would attract people. It's so because communism was popular. That's one of the things that people tend to forget, is like in East Asia, you have the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Vietnam, and even in Japan, communism was popular. The idea of sharing the wealth. Let's share the wealth. Well, so people forget that, but yeah, I'm just. It comes down to wealth. Look at this war that we're fighting with Ukraine. We're about to. Some people say we're already in World War III. That it's very much about wealth. We've got who's on the side of the United States. It's the rich countries, the rich European countries, and Japan and South Korea, and then you have these other countries that are kind of coming up. China and Russia that are starting to, and the BRICS, they're starting to come up and they're starting to rival and starting to set up a new economic system. And so it's just like NATO, the NATO countries are governments are trying to keep them down. Is that you've got it's a very much about wealth, and we're not talking about that.
Yeah, it's very much about coveting resources, a minority of the world's population attempting to covet a majority of resources. It's also about wealth in terms of military buildup, kind of, I hate to use the phrase military Keynesianism, but just pumping money into military industries. And the US is regarded as a major form of job creation. And I suspect the same thing's happening in Japan, where you have a sector of the upper middle class and upper class heavily invested in these companies like Mitsubishi.
Yeah. And while the majority of the population is suffering from austerity, we have constant, and the last 3 years have just made that stronger. The COVID policies, it's been okay. You just have to keep your mask on. You got to just keep working even in these impossible situations. And it's a wonder that Japanese don't explode. They don't get angry. Amazingly, they have this amazing ability to suffer for the greater good, which is that's a nice virtue to have. But
if you don't reach the good, when you don't experience it at any point, then you would assume an explosion would be inevitable. But here in the United States, you could say the same thing. This same trend is happening here, and people,
Yeah.
I mean, to the extent we have a civil society, it's demobilized right now.
Yeah, and in Europe, there seems to be awareness of this fake austerity, where
Yeah.
some people are getting filthy rich, and the rest of us are starving. You know, that there seems to be some awareness of that, but in the U.S. and Japan, people just keep plugging along in their own way, especially in
Well,
Japan.
to the extent it's happening in the US or Western Europe, it's that people are shifting to the populist right, at least in
Yeah,
the US. White people in the middle of the country or who live in the far suburbs are expressing their disgust with, I mean, they even use terms like the deep state. They're expressing their disgust with the ruling elite by moving to the MAGA right, or in Germany, it would be the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. And these are parties and political factions that are anti-NATO. So it's interesting to see that shift. Whereas, yeah, the left is just totally folded into the Democratic Party here, and the Green Party in Germany is one of the most militaristic parties on the planet. But we have a question here from Rat Fink and Marmalade, who's a commenter here at Rockfin. Will U.S. provocations goad China into military action? Doubtful. China plays the long game well, while the machinations in Japan and Indonesia and Philippines complicate the strategic calculations. The real issue is U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan. What are your thoughts, Joseph Essertier?
yeah, that's it. It's the real conflict is over Taiwan, and so. And these this Marines littoral regiment, this new thing that they're doing with the Marines, being able to hop from island to island, that must be scary from the perspective of Chinese, because if you're hopping from island to island and you can move incredible amounts of equipment, you can just very quickly move straight into Taiwan. If there's any kind of contingency, as they're constantly warning us about in Japan, they're preparing us for it. Taiwan contingency. Any kind of conflict is, if it happens, then America and the self-defense force of Japan are going to be right there. Well, and so yeah, Taiwan is really, and what is Taiwan? They never tell us. The mass media doesn't tell us any of the history of it.
Well, what is Taiwan, and what's the elevator pitch on Taiwan? I mean, what really is it?
Yeah. Well, there was a civil war, and there was the Communist Party of China versus the Nationalist Party had a war, and they escaped. The nationalists were being supported by the United States from the 1920s. Chiang Kai-shek goes his history, or Jiang Jieshi as it's pronounced now. He goes way back with the United States,
right?
And then in the post-war period, so he escapes with his band of losers, basically. They lost the war, and they would have completely lost it. They would have also lost Taiwan if it weren't for the United States. So and they got money and weapons and all kinds of support from the United States, and so the war never finished. So it's a little different from Ukraine. We have an unfinished war here, and why does the United States and Japan want to get involved in that?
Yeah,
I mean, that should be, normal. That should be. I don't know if that's an international law. There probably is some kind of law against getting involved in other people's wars. But yeah, so it's definitely about Taiwan, control over Taiwan. And what is Taiwan? Look at the history of Taiwan. That was Japan's first overseas colony, and Japan took control of that around the beginning of the 20th century, and that was the start of a very, very dark period for China. So
yeah,
it's no surprise at all that they're going to be, of course, they're going to be, you know, the slightest, you know, thing, the United States or Japan trying to really claim Taiwan is gonna spark a war.
yeah.
It's gonna restart a
A
war
regional war, you know,
that was never finished. So
a
yeah,
regional war. And as you mentioned, Joseph, Russia and China are in a strategic alliance, and Russia is not far from Japan, the eastern border of Russia. So this would be the trigger for a world war.
yeah. I mean, Ukraine is so far away, and we don't really had not been hearing much about it until last year in February. But now, yeah, it's wait. This is Ukraine. This is NATO versus Russia. Now that could easily spread. I mean, I was already worried about World War III almost a year ago, but now it's this guy Emmanuel Todd, he's a French intellectual. He's saying that we're already in World War III,
Yeah,
and it's very convincing. Yeah, there's already many people have pointed out how the United States and China are at each other's throats in various domains, like cyber, through through the internet, through control of space, and like here there's ships that are U.S. Ships that are in the Navy, and you've got aircraft carriers getting close to Chinese ships, and you have planes that are flying close to each other. And it's a very complex situation. It is true, like Kishida is right about that. It is very complicated. You've got South Korea and Japan and the United States, all with their militaries, and all it takes is one little thing, one little conflict. Some Americans get shot, or they get a U.S. plane gets accidentally shot down, and there you go. And then everybody takes sides, and we wind up getting into nuclear war, if not nuclear winter.
yeah, yeah. And certainly the U.S. is at war with Russia. I mean, there's no question. Just because it's using Ukraine as its proxy, in the words of Iran-Contra felon and Fox News commentator Ollie North, are bullets in their blood. It doesn't mean the U.S. isn't providing sophisticated AI weapons to Ukraine to target key Russian assets, which from Russia's point of view is seen as the U.S. waging war on it. There's no question that that's taking place. So this also ties in to another issue. Japan has shed its veneer of neutrality on the world stage in supporting the U.S. over Ukraine, and is citing Ukraine as a precedent for its remilitarization.
Right. Biden or Kishida openly said that. I have the quote here.
Well, we don't need the quote, but what are your thoughts on this development, on the internet? Japan's role on the international stage now has kind of come to the fore.
Japan has always, in the post-war period, just followed in the footsteps, or just sort of obeyed the imperial master in Washington. So I think it's just going to be that may, or probably will just continue. Japan's going to, it's like some people in Japan often say, Japan should just be declared as the 51st state. Because Japan doesn't really have its own independent foreign policy.
Right.
But
or the 54th after Israel, Ukraine, and South Korea.
Yeah. So I don't see Japan staking a claim or establishing something new, some kind of new policy. Although we could see the comeback of the co-prosperity sphere, the way some of the language that they're using now, modernization.
Yeah.
They're talking about co-prosperity. They're using that term. That people should remember the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. That was Japan's project. That was the excuse for establishing colonies. So that kind of language could, Japan, if something new is going to happen, it could very well be Japan going back to the 1930s and actually, using China and Russia as the excuse. We've got to protect our security and the security of everybody in East Asia, and that in order to have that security, we have to hold China down, hold Russia down.
Right.
We got to keep them down in their place. They're just crazy people, and then so that could give the excuse for Japan to start reclaiming some of its former colonial territories.
Right.
In the long term. There's no discussion of that right now, but I could see something like that happening, going back to the 1930s.
That certainly seems like the trajectory. And going back to that period, just the last issue I wanted to cover is something that fascinated me a lot, which is the legacy of Shinzo Abe. We've been talking about former Japanese leader Shinzo Abe of the Liberal Democratic Party as sort of the architect for this remilitarization program. But his grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, was a Class A war criminal. And his history was a factor, I would say, based on what I know, definitely not an expert here, in the assassination of Abe. So here's something I tweeted at the time, that Shinzo Abe inherited the ties his war criminal grandfather Nobusuke Kishi established with the anti-communist Unification Church of Sun Myung Moon, the Moonies, known here in Washington, D.C. as the owners of the Washington Times. The mother of Abe's assassin had been defrauded by the Moonies, and the assassin blamed his target for shielding the cult. This is this is a section from a book on the Unification Church and on Kishi, about how the Unification Church was actually involved in kidnappings and the mind control of Japanese people. And it also played an important role in the LDP, and its Japanese headquarters was built on land owned by Kishi. But there's a CIA tie-in here, as you mentioned.
Right. That's the key thing.
Yeah. So, yeah. Tell us more about that.
It's still kind of murky, but there's evidence coming out bit by bit that the Moonies were being used by the CIA to support the LDP. And there's also other evidence of direct where war criminals, including Kishi Nobusuke, were told by the U.S. government that they were they're going to be given U.S. funds from U.S. taxpayers, and they thought it was corporations. They thought they were getting money from U.S. corporations, when in fact they were getting money from the CIA.
So they were cutouts for them. Right.
And so, but that came out before this thing before Abe was assassinated. And now I haven't actually been following it, but people can read about it at Japan Focus, the Japan. anybody, Japan, if they look up Japan Focus, they can see that the journal that I'm involved with, and they there's all kinds of articles there about that. But basically, yeah, it's a real shock to Japanese because religion is so there's so much suspicion around religion in Japan,
Right.
and to think that, and then Korea, this is a Korean Christian organization. It's some sect of Christianity, from as Japanese would see it, and that they were supporting the LDP, and former people like Kishi Nobusuke, former war criminal, and which is Shinzo Abe's family. It was a real shock, and but I'm not sure. I have sort of mixed feelings about that, because people have the right to. I think people have the right to follow whatever religion they want, and the media is focusing on the religious part of it, and the fact that it's a foreign organization. This foreign organization is affecting politics. Well, there are lots of foreign organizations that affect politics, but what they really should be focusing on is as the CIA. All this money coming from the Pentagon directly into the pockets of the LDP, going way back to the straight from the end of World War II. They were Japanese elite politicians. The idea that they were being supported by the U.S. military, it just changes your whole view of what is the LDP? Who are these people? They've been pushing us into war for the last 3/4 of a century, and the only thing that held one of the things that held them back was the peace constitution and a Japanese respect for law. And unfortunately, now with the state of exception, it's like Kishida just declares, "Oh, okay, we're gonna remilitarize. We're gonna go full on into total. We're gonna join this arms race and we're gonna get ready for combat with China. What are they thinking?
Yeah.
You want to go? I've heard that from many Japanese peace activists. Like, what is our government thinking? That where we like microchips and then there are all these Japanese companies that have operations, they have factories in China,
Right.
And it's just a gigantic country. Japan is less than half the population of the United States. In the United States, China is 4 times larger than the United States in terms of population, and it's just this industrial powerhouse. Why do you want to go to war with China? Why don't you get rid of that? I mean, as an American, I think, why don't they just expel the barbarians, which was the slogan of the Meiji period, Son no Joi, respect the emperor and expel the barbarians. Well, yeah, expel the barbarians, the United States, and just make friends with these people in China. They're, they're where it's happening, and China's hasn't. Look at they have military bases. Do they have freedom of navigation operations along the coast of California? No.
Right.
So China is definitely.
How would that go down in the U.S.? Not very well.
Yeah. So yeah. But yeah, I think that's the thing that the mass media is really downplaying or trying to ignore, is the CIA money. That this religious organization was a conduit for military U.S. military funds and pushing the LDP in a certain direction, which is, that's not democratic. That's not Woodrow Wilson's what's the word in English? Minzoku jiketsu in Japanese. The self-determination. That's not self-determination.
Yeah. No, I mean, the whole point. Well, first of all, the Unification Church was set up through the KCIA, which was the Korean CIA.
Right.
And it was an obvious a vehicle for U.S. influence and anti-communism. And
right.
so
And South Korea was a military dictatorship backed by the United States.
Yeah.
So of course,
a complete lack of democracy, and also not very much economic development until the
right
70s
until the 1980s
or
It
80s.
was
Yeah.
before they surpassed North Korea. North
Yeah.
Korea was richer than South Korea until the 1980s.
Right. So you have this pro-dictatorship CIA influence vehicle moving into Japan, and the whole point, it was very clear, it's just to prevent any leftward momentum in Japanese politics and to bring us to where we are today, which, as you point out, Joseph Essertier, has us hurtling towards World War III with Japanese, Taiwanese people, and Filipino people on the front lines. They will be the first ones to die. And if anyone thinks that they're going up against the China of old, the white army of Chiang Kai-shek with a few submachine guns and maybe some brave young men, they're absolutely deluded. This is a country with access to hypersonic technology, nuclear technology, advanced AI capability, and the largest population on the planet, which has as high morale as any other country, is willing to fight for its national ideals and security as much as any other country. So it just seems to be an example of collective insanity.
Yeah, nobody wants it. If you talk to ordinary people, they're not aware that it's happening here in Japan, at least. I don't know what people are thinking in the Philippines or in Taiwan. It's really hard to find out what's going on in Taiwan. But you see, look at the protests when what's her name came from Pelosi when she visited Taiwan. What happened? There were protests, major protests in Taiwan. They don't want to go to war with China. Taiwanese, I'm sure they know better than we do that this will not end well for Taiwan. They don't want that. But somehow the elites of Taiwan are just totally in bed with the United States.
Well, let's close with some sage words by Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan, just as an example of what kind of leadership and the mentality that Japan's leadership and Taiwan's leadership and now South Korea's administration are following. These are some really sage words.
Sources of strength is democracy. I said at a meeting, sources of strength is democracy. I said at a meeting earlier with the parliamentarians, in our earliest days of our founding of our country, Benjamin Franklin, our presidency, said, freedom and democracy. Freedom and democracy on one thing, security here. We can't have either if we don't have both. So, security, economic, security, economy, and again, and governance, they're all related, and we want Taiwan to always have freedom and security, and we're not backing away from that. Thank you.
So she's first of all, she says Ben Franklin is the president. Our presidency, Ben Franklin, was never president. And then she literally called Ben Franklin our presidency. And she's there on the most provocative visit ever to just completely inflame relations with China and set the stage for war. And she's talking about how if you sacrifice freedom and security, you have neither. But she completely misquotes Ben Franklin. And the whole concept of what Franklin was saying is completely antithetical to the point of her visit and everything the U.S. is doing in the region. So that's what you've signed up for. Those are the people leading you to the brink. But Joseph Essertier, thank you so much for your valuable insights and for a really great conversation. And we've been listening to Joseph Essertier, activist scholar based in Japan and the Japanese coordinator of the Japanese branch of World Beyond War. And this was another episode of the Grayzone at Rockfin, exclusively at Rockfin, although we'll feature segments of this on our YouTube channel, but you can tune in here every week. We're trying to warm up this platform again. It's given me the opportunity to have a lot of conversations that would have been censored on YouTube, but we're going to just continue to try to keep them going every week and feature them where we can on our other channels. So anyway, thanks again, everybody, for joining. Thanks for all your comments, and meet me here next week. Peace.